All right, so this time on the deep dive, we're wading into some pretty interesting strategic waters with Clausewitz.
Definitely. Always a good idea to revisit the classics.
Absolutely, especially Book 7, Chapter 8, where he tackles river crossings. And look, we both know this isn't just some theoretical exercise for you.
Right, got to bring it back to the real world.
Exactly. For someone out there serving in the military, understanding how a mind like Clausewitz approached strategy, well, that could give you a real edge.
Couldn't agree more. And what always strikes me about Clausewitz is he doesn't see a river just as like a blue line on a map, you know?
He's seeing the bigger picture, for sure.
He is. He's seeing them as these psychological factors in warfare, which honestly is just as relevant today as it was back in the 19th century.
So let's unpack that a bit. Now, on the surface, any military mind, they look at a river, they're thinking, okay, pretty solid defensive barrier,
Yeah.
right?
Hard to argue with that. Tough to cross, limits the enemy's movement. Seems like a gift for the defender, right?
It certainly does. So where's Clausewitz going with this?
So he agrees, to a point, but, and this is classic Clausewitz, he's always got a but. He argues that this often makes defenders a little too comfortable, too reliant on the river itself. They get so focused on holding that line at the water's edge, they can miss the bigger strategic picture.
Okay, so they're so busy hunkering down by the riverbank, they forget about everything else. Doesn't sound like a recipe for victory.
Not at all. In fact, it can be a recipe for disaster. Put yourself in the attacker's shoes for a second. You know the defender is completely committed to holding that river line. What does that tell you? What options does that open up?
Well, if their attention's all on the river, you could potentially swing around, outflank them, maybe force them to spread their forces thin, trying to cover too much ground, or even...
Bypass them altogether.
Exactly.
And that's precisely the kind of thinking Clausewitz wants us to engage in. Don't get stuck on the immediate, the obvious, right? See beyond that. Terrain's just one piece of a much larger strategic puzzle. You're hitting on a key point, because it's not just about the physical terrain, is it?
Right, we're talking about the mental game here, too.
Exactly. The psychological impact. The defender can get so fixated on the river, it's like a weight on their thinking. And that can actually work against them.
How so? You'd think that sense of security would be an advantage.
In the short term, maybe. But hold that thought for a second, because Clausewitz, he argues that rivers are actually most effective defensively when the attacker, well, when they're not dead set on picking a fight right there.
Okay, now that does seem a little counterintuitive. If you're attacking, why not force the issue?
Now think about it. It's not that the attacker is afraid of a fight. It's more their goals might be broader. Maybe they're aiming to grab territory, disrupt supply lines, you know, the long game, wear the enemy down over time.
So in those scenarios, the river actually plays into the defender's hands. How does that work?
Because every hour, every day that the attacker's stuck on the wrong side of that river, it's time for the defender to get their defenses set, bring up reinforcements, maybe even prepare a counteroffensive.
It's like a pressure cooker. The longer it takes to cross, the hotter things get for the attacker.
Right. All those logistical challenges, the risk, the uncertainty, it just keeps building. And that plays right into what Clausewitz calls the friction of war. Things rarely go exactly to plan in combat.
Chaos, the fag of war, all that.
Exactly. And a river, well, that just throws another log on the fire, makes everything that much more unpredictable for the attacker.
BUT. And this is where it gets really interesting. If the attacker IS going for that knockout blow, that's when the defender's reliance on the river can become a real problem.
Okay, so we've gone from a river being a potential advantage for the defender to a liability, all depending on the attacker's mindset.
It's all about context, isn't it? And how that river shapes the way both sides are thinking. But to your point, if the attacker is dead set on a decisive engagement, the river can actually work against the defender.
So why would that be? I mean, it's still a big obstacle to overcome, right? Sure, but it can also create a false sense of security. The defender might assume, okay, they have to cross here or here, and that makes them predictable.
And predictable means vulnerable.
100%. They end up fighting the attacker's fight on the attacker's terms, instead of dictating the terms of engagement themselves.
Which takes us right back to that idea you were talking about earlier, outbidding the opponent. So, outbidding, how does that play out in this scenario, with a river in the middle of it all?
Think of it this way. You're not just trying to match the enemy's moves, you're trying to anticipate, to outmaneuver, to strike where they least expect it.
And with a river, that could be tricky. You're limited in terms of where you can actually cross.
Right, but that's where the outbidding comes in. Maybe you find a lightly defended spot along the river, somewhere the enemy isn't expecting you.
And then you hit it hard and fast before they can react.
Exactly. Rapid deployment, establish a bridgehead, and suddenly you're dictating the terms. You force them to respond to your move.
So it's about using the terrain to your advantage, but also about using speed and surprise to disrupt the enemy's plans, force them to play your game.
Precisely. And this is where modern military technology, well, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to Clausewitz's ideas, doesn't it?
Because back in Clausewitz's day, you were talking horses and wagons, maybe some early artillery. Moving large numbers of troops and equipment, that was a massive undertaking.
And slow. Let's not forget slow. A river that was a serious, serious obstacle. Forcing a crossing under fire, well, that was a risky proposition, to say the least.
And nowadays,
Night and day. Today you've got modern transportation, air power, rapid bridging capabilities. A determined attacker can overcome those obstacles much quicker, much more decisively. It's a whole different ballgame.
so with all that in mind, how do we connect Clausewitz to modern warfare?
You have to look beyond the specifics. The technology's changed, sure, but the underlying principles, those are timeless. An attacker can use long-range precision fires to neutralize defensive positions, airdrop troops behind enemy lines, even use stealth technology to mask their movements, maintain the element of surprise.
Makes you wonder what Clausewitz would make of it all, doesn't it? All this technology.
Oh, I think he'd be fascinated. Don't forget, Clausewitz, he was all about adapting to the changing nature of warfare. He understood that technology, it's a tool, but the real battle, it's always been fought in the minds of the commanders.
The mental terrain of warfare.
Exactly. Understanding your enemy, shaping the narrative, exploiting those psychological vulnerabilities, those are the timeless principles.
So does Clausewitz offer any examples, maybe a cautionary tale or two, about how not to approach a river crossing?
Actually, yeah, he does. He talks about the Austrians on the Lower Rhine back in 1796. They made the classic mistake, got so fixated on the river as a defensive barrier, figured that's where Napoleon would have to strike.
And Napoleon, being Napoleon.
Oh, he played them like a fiddle. He knew they were expecting him to make a move on the river, so he feigned an attack, drew their attention, their reserves, the whole 9 yards. Meanwhile, his main force, they swung around to the south, found a nice quiet spot, crossed the river practically unopposed.
The Austrians were completely caught off guard.
They were. They allowed the terrain to dictate their strategy instead of using it to shape the strategy, and they paid the price. Big time.
It all comes back to outbidding.
It does. Napoleon, he understood that the river was just a piece of the puzzle, the real battle. It was about understanding his opponent's expectations and then doing the unexpected.
So the big takeaway here, and this is something I hope our listeners, especially those serving in the military, really take to heart terrain. Whether it's a river, a mountain range, a dense urban environment, it's not just about the physical features. It's about understanding how those features can influence perception, how they can be used to shape the narrative of the battlefield, and how ultimately they can be exploited to achieve victory.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's Clausewitz in a nutshell. Timeless wisdom.
Absolutely. And to our listeners out there, thank you for all you do. Keep asking the tough questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never, ever underestimate the power of understanding that mental terrain of warfare.